I think it's about the time to start. So it has been academic 6 minutes, as always, as you know. We are from the university side of this campus. My name is Veiko Lember. I'm head of Ragnar Nurkse School of Innovation and Governance at Tallinn University of Technology. And the Nurkse School, together with LIPSE projects led by University of Erasmus and Technopol, and together with the Finest Twins team, the consortia, are happy to welcome you here. Yet another Smart City seminar, this time on technology innovation and public sector organizations. Finest Twins is an initiative to set up a center of excellence here in Tallinn, together with City of Helsinki, Aalto University, EIT Europe, and the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication of Estonia. It's a bold attempt. We still don't know whether this will be the case, but we put every effort into this initiative. And today we have this very special occasion within the Smart City seminars to have a talk on not only about smart cities and technologies and public spaces, but also changed the public sector innovation and the role of technology in that in general. As said, this is organized this time in cooperation with the LIPSE project, which is one of the biggest research projects in past years in Europe, bringing together around 10 universities in Europe, and it's about public sector innovation and social innovation in general. We have so far in the previous seminars, as you know, as some of you know, we have touched upon many specific smart city issues and challenges. So today we would like to broaden this perspective a bit by bringing in more sort of social side of the innovation endeavor as such. While I was walking actually here today, I have this nasty habit to follow news even if I walk. I was alone, obviously. There was a policy report published this week that was done by Nesta. This is a think tank based in London, claiming that the UK local governments could save 15 billion British pound per year if they went digital all over. Now, of course, the question that has been around for a long time is that if the technological perspective is there, why is not the change taking place? And actually, there is sort of the emerging consensus also in the academia, the part I represent here, is that actually when we think of transformation towards smart city, or if we think of applying technology into public sector, it is actually the social institutions, it is the organizational issues, it is the change in organizations and relationships between different stakeholders that are more and more key to the process that we witness here today when we think of and talk about technology and society, technology and public sector, technology and market developments. So we have this wonderful setup of speakers today. I'm glad that approximately half who actually registered to the meeting actually made it here. So I would, less than half. So even more, you deserve our gratitude. We have an excellent set of speakers today who will open this issue, or who will approach this broad issue of technology innovation and public sector organizations from different angles. We have the idea, or the setup for the seminar today is that first there will be 4 presentations, following quick Q&A session after each presentation, and then in the end we're going to have a sort of a panel discussion, and we try to sort of sort out where we are and where are we heading. So we have 1 or 2 central key questions for today that we would like to shed some light. One is that how can we assess the state of the art as of today? Has the progress, when we speak of technology and innovation and change in public sector, has this change taken place? Has it been radical? Has it been incremental? What are the enablers and barriers? And also, is technology something that actually helps us in achieving societal goals or good life in general? And the second question is, of course, what capabilities and skills and capacities in general do we actually need in order to make smart cities happen from social, from organizational, from public sector perspective? So we sort of move away. We started off from a rather technical issues in the beginning of the seminar, but now sort of we naturally almost end up with speaking as relevant, if not even more relevant issues when it comes to smart cities. So without further ado, I would like now to give floor to Dr. Piret Tõnurist, who has set up the seminar today and who has been actively involved both in Finest Twins as well as in the LIPSE project. And Piret will then introduce you the speakers and some more details.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ott. Very happy to be here. I am the product manager of e-residency, meaning my job is to look after what is the strategy, why e-residents should apply, what are we doing with the program, where are we going with the program, and what is the product that we are actually selling. So as it is a government initiative, as it is a service, we still call e-residency as a product. So we define e-residency as having 3 core products that I will shed some light later. The program, what's very important to say, like a disclaimer in the beginning, that it's still at the beta phase. So we openly communicate that the program is not ready. The product itself is not ready. And we are changing it constantly. So week after week, we discover something new about the e-residents. The value proposition, what we are offering them, changes during time. So it's very important to understand that we work as a startup. We are funded by the government, but we work as a startup. So 2 very, very controversial things going together, a government startup. What we claim to do is to unlock the entrepreneurial potential. So we offer the possibility for anyone in the world who is interested to open up a company in Estonia. So we offer a virtual business environment. In its essence, those of you who are acquainted with the Estonian ID card, it's not anything relevantly new. The infrastructure is the same, the system is the same, but the card is different in the sense that we're giving it out to everyone in the world who is interested. So an e-residency card itself does not grant you a citizenship in Estonia. You can't vote or you can't travel with the card. Neither it is a tax residency in Estonia. So quite often people mistake this as to be some magical wand that they don't have to pay taxes and can come and live in Estonia. That is not the case. What we are offering is a digital identity. So Estonian government who says that you are who you claim to be behind your computer. That's the main value proposition here. What can you do with the card? I'm sure you all know. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but mostly virtual business environment. You can create a company, you can create a bank account, you can sign documents, and also secure your documents in a cryptographic way. A bit about the timeline to go into the past so you would understand how the program has come into life. The project was kicked off in 2014. It has moved very, very fast. Usually programs in the government sector, the public sector, do not follow the same path as this program has. So personally, I came from the private sector, and I was amazed at the beginning how long these processes were. And I found a lot of dismotivating people. But managed to change that with this program. And basically after 2 months, when the project was launched, the legislation was approved by Parliament unanimously to give out e-residency cards. So I have to say that I'm not sure that everyone in the Parliament understood what they were voting for, but still it was unanimously passed. So that's nice. At the end of the year, the first e-resident card was issued. So that was Edward Lucas. And in May 2015, so we went into the public beta, meaning that we opened up the embassies and you could receive the e-residency card from 39 locations all over the world. So before May, you actually had the e-residency card. If you wanted one, you had to come to Estonia. You had to take a paper and write everything and submit it through the Estonian police. So that's not something that we would like to say that is very e-Estonia. And during that time, we unlocked and unleashed the let's say, entrepreneurial potential of the website that you could now apply via your computer being anywhere in the world. So currently with this week's statistics, we have around 9,500 applications, around 8,000 e-residents and 23,000 potential. So this meaning that these are the people that are in our newsletter who have not applied yet for e-residency for various reasons, mostly because they don't think that e-residency yet is a product that is ready for them. So for example, today, if you want to open up a bank account in Estonia, you still have to travel here and you have to meet with the bank representative. So that does not go together with our main product of offering a virtual business environment. And we are changing the legislation for it, and hopefully in half a year's time it will be possible to have the face-to-face meeting with an online video bridge. A quick business case, use case that we have built our product number 1 on is Stanislav from Ukraine, who is not trusted in the European Union, who does not have access to electronic payment service providers. He has a very hard life of issuing endless forms, unstable climate, and impractical alternatives. So this is just a business case in the sense that many of these problems can be taken from Ukraine and implemented to other countries in the world. So we use Stanislav as a business case because he had an imminent interest and he was very willing to help us in the sense that he was documenting his e-residency journey and roadmap. We're actually using him to build our product roadmap. So what we offer Stanislav is a legal registration. So before he has to apply for e-residency, he has to be accepted for e-residency. Then he can create a company in Estonia using his e-residency card. He can register a bank account, currently having had to come to Estonia. And he can use a payment provider. So PayPal, Braintree, some payment service provider that he sells his products on the internet, and he can withdraw his money from his PayPal account. And he can sign documents digitally. And Stanislav is now an e-resident. He has a company in Estonia and he's selling his IT services through Estonia. So we have solved his problem. The process of becoming an e-resident is quite simple. This 4-step, 1 month. Currently the state fee is 100 euros. It was 50 euros before February, but the costs have gone up. And there are 39 locations all over the world that you can pick up the residency card. So going into the future, we are expanding the program in the sense that we are hoping to make deals with the third-party service providers called visa centers that you would be able to receive the documents in over 200 locations all over the world. So currently we have 39 Estonian embassies or consulates. And if we look at the end goal of e-residency, which is 10 million e-Estonians, e-residents. So it's impossible to scale with 39 Estonian embassies because we will have to open much more of them. And so at the end of this year, we hope to have a collaboration with the visa centers, private companies who actually would issue these documents for us. So the application process would be the same. They apply through our website, and the Estonian police does all the background checks and sends the documents, but the visa centers would be the ones who do the face-to-face check, because there has to be a certified, say, representative who sees that you are a real actual person, looks on your photo and the document and says that yes, this is your digital identity. So there has to be a face-to-face check. We can't just send the documents to people's homes with post. At some point we asked e-residents, what's the motivation? Why do they want to become e-residents? And 37% of them said that location-independent international business. So this is the main value proposition, what we are offering them. They don't have to be tied in one place. They can be anywhere in the world. They can have a business. They can be in IT. They can be in consulting. They can be wherever, what kind of business they would like. And they can administer their company from their computer. The second would be bringing business to Estonia. So there was a fair amount of people who are actually interested in bringing their businesses away from their home countries. So for example, Ukraine, for example, Finland, for example, France, for example, Brazil. People who are having trouble in their home countries, they're a bit disappointed in their public services in general, and they were interested in the Estonian economic environment and the public services here. Also, they were fans of e-residency. So this was the first half of the year in mostly from Silicon Valley, the Bay Area, United States, where people wanted to be e-residents because it was cool. So as you said, that in Germany, when I do some presentations somewhere around the world, also people come up to me later and they take out their e-residency card. You have one. They take out their e-residency card and they show it to me. It's like, I'm an e-resident. And I asked them, so what do you do with it? It's like, currently nothing, but I carry it around with me everywhere. So it's like a loyalty card in that sense for some people. And we openly say that there is an X%, so it was 16% 3 months ago, of people who don't use the card. And it's okay, but they have paid the fee. They want to be a part of this club of e-Estonians because they believe in the values. They believe that this digital identity is changing something. I'll bring you an example. When I was in United States with the Prime Minister a year ago, and we were driving with Uber, and the Uber taxi driver asked if where I was from, and I said from Estonia, and he said, Estonia. You are defining a nation state. You're creating a digital democracy. And the e-residency program was very young at that time, and I was very surprised that the taxi driver knew. And apparently the US media really picked it up a year ago. And every person has a different perception of what e-residency is. So the Americans had the perception that it's something to really change how democracy will look like. So they're defining a nation's borders. And we thought that we were just giving out ID cards and a digital identity. So it's very interesting to see what kind of different perceptions people have. So going more in depth into the future side of e-residency, so where it could go. I was telling you about different products. The product number one being a virtual business environment, so people could register themselves as a company in Estonia and do business without being in Estonia. Here are some examples of private companies that have integrated e-residency product number 2. And the product number 2 is a digital authentication platform. So the method of e-residency, or as an Estonian ID card, to log in very securely to different databases using the X-Road system. So these are startups or already bigger companies that have taken this certificates, implemented the API into their systems, that you can now use e-residency card to log into their websites. And the value proposition here is that the Estonian government is actually providing them a know your customers, say, check before they need to do it. So, for example, going into the companies here, Funderbeam, an Estonian startup, Teleport, an Estonian startup, BitNation, so a blockchain technology hub. So these are companies that now are able to have e-residents log into their systems, and they know that you are who you claim to be. For example, Nasdaq Estonia implemented e-residency, and you can have shareholder meetings without having to come to the meeting yourself. So you just put in your card, you put in your PIN code, and you can vote in your shareholder meetings. So these are just examples of how e-residency can be implemented. So if we're talking more on the public services side, e-residents are also able to use healthcare systems. So for example, there are many Finnish citizens who come to Estonia for, let's be honest, the cheap healthcare. Also dentistry. So they come to Estonia and they can actually, if they have an e-residency card, they can actually go to the pharmacy and they can have their prescriptions subscribed to them, and they can use the e-residency card to get their drugs. They can go to the doctor and they can have their epicrisis in the e-health web, and they can check the data later when they go back home to Finland. So they don't have to come here, they don't have to call the doctor. So there are numerous use cases for the e-residency card, but the important part is that it's a digital identity, that the Estonian government is providing you a digital identity, which is very unique in the world because no other country is doing it, no private company is as secure as a government who is offering the same kind of service. And as the program is very young, I'd like to be here after a year with a picture like this. Hopefully. I just wanted to include one slide about media as well, how e-residency has managed to gather different media outlets. Here, for example, BBC, CNN. So this is where the Uber taxi driver in the States got the information about e-residency. So it has really been picked up by mainstream media as a means to really change how people perceive countries and their borders. Promised to talk about a little bit more about the future, what we are working on currently. I can't reveal all the details, all the companies and what we're doing, but I can talk about some. So for example, we are in discussion with the International Maritime Organization. So their case study is that they have a lot of ships and they have a lot of crew members whose certificates are all on paper, and they're all on the boats. So if something happens to the boats, for example, they sink, they don't have any more certificates, no one knows who the crew members are. And what we are offering for them is basically e-residency to have their e-certificates online anywhere. So boats and seamen both. EBAN, European Business Angels Network, we're in contact with them to use e-residency as a means of implementing digital single market in the European Union. So I'm sure some of you know about the eIDAS Act, that from 2018 it is obligatory for every European Union member state to acknowledge the Estonian ID card or the e-residency card as the highest form of login authentication method. So you have to be let into your public service, whatever the service is, you have to get into the other member state public service as well with the e-residency card. And we are concentrating more on Asia because we see a very big interest from that part of the world to have business in Estonia and to look at the Estonian, or let's say not just Estonia, but European business and the European public sector as well. We are working on smoothing the application process, which has been very difficult at the beginning, but it's improving. And our target markets for this year are United States, Singapore, and India. If you have any more information requests, information interest, then these are the links to follow. And there's a statistics link. Do we have web connection here as well? I can show you some. So this is a tool that we use inside our team. Just to give you a quick understanding what we use every day. So what is important is, for example, the e-residence statistics regarding companies. So this is how we can actually measure that the program has been beneficial for the Estonian government, which is one part of what we have to do. Starting from the program beginning in 2014, there have been almost 400 new companies established by e-residents. So this is an actual number that we can say that the e-residents have created a new number of companies into Estonia that otherwise might not have been created. Also, we can measure the engagement of e-residents and they being the board members of Estonian companies. So this number is around 800 currently. So e-residents already being on the board of Estonian companies, the engagement of their companies. So these are not new companies. The companies were founded before the board members were e-residents, but they have applied for e-residency and now they can sign, for example, documents and do other processes. A very sad statistics is gender equality. When we look at e-residents who have applied, so for, let's say, almost 85% of them are men. That is very sad. Right. So I can share the presentation with you afterwards as well. This is a tool that we use inside our team, but it's public. So you can get media recognition, you can get our support tickets, you can see what our e-residents are up to, what kind of companies. So for example, number one classification of all the companies is still business and management. Number two, wholesale trade, and number three, computer programming. So statistics, what are the companies actually doing? And here you can see some media heat map, what's happening with e-residency, tweets. So all the relevant information if you want to keep yourself posted about e-residency. So this is the first e-resident, Edward Lucas, and I think that's all on my part, so please ask questions. It's a very controversial, interesting topic. Thank you.
For this possibility. Unfortunately, the predictive analytics part is the thin part in here, but I'll talk about it a little bit. So, thank you for having me here, and if you have any questions or any complaints about this or something is obvious, please let me know. It was quite nice actually to see this e-residency card. I had in the Finnish national identity card in something like 2002, and it was very nice and expensive. Unfortunately, you couldn't do anything with it, and I have not seen yet a reason to renew my card. I assume that there will be in not too distant future time when it will replace what we now use the bank systems for. And
the Estonian government actually copied the ID card from Finland.
Yeah, yes, but you didn't.
But what we did was to make it obligatory for everyone. So in Finland it was not obligatory, and as I said, the first 3 years there were no services. You could do nothing with the card, but then slowly things started to happen.
Yes.
And we predict the same trend with e-residency. So currently the program is 1.5 years old, and there are not so many services that are open, but in 10 years' time it will be something else, hopefully.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. That was my actually to the point. And these are important. How you get these. Same with the open data, which I'm going to talk about here. Now you could see that open data is in the value of disillusionment. People see nothing coming out of it. You can see already that some things are coming, but it takes years still. Here are some things about me. I don't want to talk too much about those. I want to talk a little bit about this openness as an idea. This comes from Anders Chydenius, who was known as Adam Smith of Northern Europe. And he had very, very interesting ideas of governance in the 18th century. He actually invented the world's first Freedom of Information Act in Diet of Sweden in 1766. He almost lost his head on this idea because at that time the idea was that king brings wisdom directly from the god, and there's no reason for the king in any way to explain why things came about. And he said that there should be transparency about decision making. And the second important idea from him is that economics exists for the benefit of little people and not the other way around. Why I want to always talk about this is that the School of Business building where information systems resides is Chydenia building, and these ideas are important also for this thinking about what things like e-residency, for example, openness of government and open services are all about. They are for the people. Here I have some definitions for open data. Why I like to give this is that usually we have asked 5 people, they have 5 different definitions of these issues. But the idea that certain data should be freely available to everyone to use and republish as they wish without restrictions from copyright, patents, or other mechanisms of control. This is very, very wide. And Open Knowledge Foundation uses pieces of content or data open for anyone, that is open for anyone to use, reuse, and redistribute, subject only to the requirement of attribute and or share alike. And these are interesting in that sense that, for example, in Finland we had in the 90s, around 2000, the idea that most of the public services should be profit centers, and they created different services that they sell, and many of these center around data. Then in 2013, 2014, the idea came that, okay, people have actually paid once already for that data, so it should be free to use. And this was quite a bit of new thinking, because before it was seen as something that creates profit. Small profit often, but they were profit centers for the different parts of administration. And there are some very, very valuable things in there, like detailed map information, different kinds of services built on top of maps, which people pay money for, and suddenly you say that this should be available for free. And then actually more interesting services could come on top of that. This is slowly now changing in Finland, that the idea is that now it should be more open, and individual service developers are able to reuse this government data. Openness itself has several different ideas. Technical openness is the first one, and it has been discussed for a long time. And if you look at open data, most research literature is about making interfaces available, standardizing the data so that the formats are available there. And interestingly, actually, we have studied companies, small companies that develop these open ideas, and most of them are not so worried about data formats. They are mostly worried that there's some data available, even if it's something that you can use screen scraping for. So they just read available web pages, and they don't care about, for example, APIs, which we saw as crucial for this, so that you have standardized data. Next level is, of course, legal openness, contracts, copyright, privacy, data protection, and national security. These are interesting that things like national security come very, very soon into play when we talk about opening most of the government data, because some seemingly trivial things can turn out to be quite dangerous if they are connected with each other. Similarly, privacy is here a true concern. People's data being used, even anonymously, it can be dangerous if it's too detailed and too easy to modify. That is the other part of, say, very, very good possibilities of identifying people with identity numbers or identity cards. The flip side of being able to provide good services and connect them is that it could be misused. Then commercial openness, there's this small thing about price of access. Why this is important is that European Union says that most of the data produced by public authorities in European Union should be available for free, barring reasonable costs of making it available. There's long discussion about what is the reasonable cost of making it available. Then how you make
tax and customs business. Because I'm thinking we are doing it differently in a meaning of how a traditional organization in the public service is managed. So I've been 20 years in business, and I'm kind of dreamed about such kind of organization, and I'm now saying that there's no door in my house. I have to knock and ask, can we do so? We just do. So, and then that's a simple thing.
Exactly. The context, I mean, Estonian tax authority has been one of the forerunners when it comes to applying technology in public sector and for public service provision. And I think tax authorities are sort of a very interesting case also because this actually demonstrates to us how then technology really sort of impacts or changes public service provision as such. And I think this is why the case of tax authority.
So the answer is, to be short, technology is there. No innovation. Has been already for years. But takes time to get here, that we can do the things differently. And it's the most hard thing, how to innovate here, to get rid of the whole fashion activities or something like that, even in Estonian tax and customs. Because as you very rightly said, Veiko, we were first in a country to introduce the e-services. At that time we were criticized. Why we need e-taxation for the privileged people having computers at their home? Criticism 15 years ago in Estonia, because now everyone had computers at their home. Now 15 years has gone, again we have a people having not computers. They don't have computers, they have just smartphones, and they don't have places to make their declarations, etc. We haven't spent the money a lot in comparing with other countries, nothing, cents. With 18 millions during 10 years, it means that no ready-made solutions, only tailor-made solutions in the sense of IT. And it pushes your people to focus on the processes. If you buy something ready-made solutions, like Finnish customs now, I know, implementing new tax collection system, cost of that is 200 million euros. 200 million euros. Estonian state haven't had such money for decades. Just 80 kilometers between one organization spends it by click, because they're implementing SAP or something like that. I don't know. Licensing everything. This graph shows, according to OECD, we are somewhere here. Some year we are first, second, third. Switzerland, Sweden. Sweden collects a lot of money, that's why he's so high. But we are effective. I can show the politics and said, let's do nothing. Already we are there. How we can do more? It's compared to Poland or Germany or Czech Republic. We collect the money. I would say Estonian tax morale it's very okay, and so 99% of tax is coming voluntary. Tax and customs behaving behind somewhere, that they're keeping a phone or something like that. And it has to do more and more, I will tell you about. Some words about structure. I think if we take Estonian public sector, it's overmanaged. Overmanaged. Too much managers, especially top managers. If you ask me, what about this structure? If you see this structure, do you understand something? Even I don't understand. So, but what I have to know is I have 11 departments. This one is not really departments, just the people working, media people next to me. But I have 11 departments. That's it. It's all I have to know as a top managers. How we are organized. I don't care. Same as the planning. I don't have slides here, but it's over-planned. I don't have working plan in my house. If you ask me how much we are doing something, I don't know. Even I don't care how much. What I care for is impact. Does we influence something? Does our activities pushing some kind of phenomenon in a society? So it means that all my heads of departments acting like a director general, clearly. They have all money. I have 33 million euros for personnel. Just 2% of it I have in my own hands. All others are delegated to mid managers, creating them the motivation to seek the efficiency. And there's one benefit more. If I go to around in the counties, on the portables, no one asks salary from me because they know I don't have the money. Clear. Ask the head of a porta post, head of a bureau. Simple as that. But generally in Estonia, it's a different way. Ministers buying the cars, putting the salaries. If you ask what minister says in public interviews, it's a micromanagement. Very, very often. My wife says, don't ask Marek about the tax issues. He doesn't know nothing about it. And she's true. I know who knows. But me, myself, I don't know. I've heard something during my recent 4 years or 20 years in being in a business. But it's not up to me. I've been in my organization today just 2 hours. I spent 3 hours in the parliament, now 2 hours here. I was somewhere else, bringing the money in, bringing a relationship in. So, because my director general is working without me, that's clear. And I think I know the secret in how to do it, because I can trust my people. I can accept the mistakes. I go ahead TransferWise saying last year that we praising the mistakes, paying the bonuses if somebody doing the mistakes. I like this idea so much. Please make the mistakes, because otherwise we don't learn. Otherwise it's stability. Nothing happens. And I'm very much, if something happening, some doing, of course I'm not expecting. But if happens, now my work starts. Dealing with media, dealing with relationships, so setting down. Trust is there. The latest news that we are on 4th place. We have a defense force. It's last quarter. But it's very much related with tax morale. If 99% of tax is coming voluntary, you have to keep the trust or transparency. So, and then that's why you have to go and talk and to create this relationship. Very high. We can't compete with Rescue Bureau or 911 or something like that. We don't save lives. We take the money. But they are producing such a graph, and this is one of my KPI. I have 3 KPIs. Just minister asked me. One is like how much I collect taxes, which is very poor, very historical one. I want to get rid of that KPI, how much I collect taxes. The second one is a level of shadow economy, and the third one is a trust, just 3 of it. How I achieve it, it's up to me. No up to ministry, no up to minister. It's up to me. So the business in Estonia, 5,000 company pays 90% of taxes. It's more or less everywhere same. Big one pays the most. I would say, let's get 3. Let's give 3 whole of, except, what can't say it's in English. How? Let's focus on 5,000. We have more or less 100,000 company operating every month or monthly. Let's focusing on this 5,000 and let's send the signal for 95,000 companies that we don't care. We don't care, for example, about your bookkeepings. It's up to you as entrepreneurs to do your bookkeeping as much as you want. But to collect 10% taxes and put the pressure, somebody here at Tax and Customs will come maybe. It's a history, it's past. You can't do so. You have to differ. And then my way of thinking that these 95,000 companies has to create the understanding or feeling that okay, the contribution to the treasury is not so high, it's just 10%. But keep people as healthy as you could. And if you can, just pay taxes also 10%. And we don't care about your tax bookkeepings. Believe me, we can earn more money because of this feeling creates in the companies after that. But believe me, no legislation in Estonia supports this kind of attitude. No legislation. Our tax legislation coming from 90s, 20 years old, everyone must do the same. Doesn't matter how big you are. Every month, almost. So just overview. Our e-taxation is poor, old, so old-fashioned. Nobody mentioned it. And then during next 3-4 years, we will rewrite all our IT solutions. All. We have about more than 200 different IT applications or systems. More than 200 different ones, and we will rewrite all of them. It costs the same. We have spent money for last decade, about 20 million. So we're getting more. This graph shows that with 15 years, most of the information we will getting electronically, but it's a pretty old one because why we need this information at all? Now is a question. Why everyone should send the information every month to Tax and Customs? Why? This the graph. Every country can do it nowadays. What is the next step? What is the next step? So VAT automized control we introduced in a recent 2 years. Big mess, big discussions to should we do something. We changed on one paradigm, and if we're talking about the shadow economy, it's not up to state to solve it. It's up to state and business to solve it, and both has to contribute. One has to share the information, another is to just to setting the environment, react adequate way. And after this solution, we are collected extra 100 million euros. 100 million euros during 1 year. Nobody asked where this 100 million went year before, 2 years before, 3 years before, 100. Where? And now we set the base up, and the red line shows that we collected more in the same time. The turnover on purchases went down. So it can't be so. That it means that the economy is much cleaner nowadays. We have invested a lot to analytical capacity. This is the only toolbox solution we are using SAS Institute software to do the mass data for analytics, and we have done it already 10 years. And we have climbed up here. We started 2004, 2008, just what is understanding the data at all. What kind of data we have to, and could have. So next to queries. So you can see what we can do there. Reporting to get the information what we have done recently on the past. Expert models, how to pick up the control. So who is like to foster, who we have to control. We climbed up year by year. And now we are somewhere here. Data mining and social network analysis. Who will die? Look, we turned around. It doesn't matter who to control, but to send risk, if you take 5,000 company who pays 90% of taxes, who are healthy, who are not, where is the risk are, we can lose the money. So, and then they predict somehow. And it climb up how to do, what is the best, what could happen, to make a prognosis, not explaining what happened last month or last decade or last quarter, but to see, analyzing the behavior, what could happen or what will happen in your economy. Because we know economic relations, and it's. I have an intelligence department about 60 people working there, and it's believe me, it's a very challenge to turn it around, to just pick up the control objects, instead of that to see, to predict, to make a risk, to analyze the risk, how much you lose to revenue. Or the tax base, what is the influence tax moral. We have done a lot. I think that the Marshalls, our structure, I will not stop here, but the organization's recent 4 years reduced the staff 21% during the 4 years period. We have a state reform here, but the plan is 0.7% per year. It takes 21 years or even more, 25 years to set up such a speed. In my organization, if we want, I'm just as a director general saying that we are going to the phase we reduced our staff. And my director generals, who are really director generals, I have to hold horses, because they are so effective oriented. And then we are reduced the staff 21%. We are calculating like labor cost per position. What was it? 2011, 40,500 per year together with taxes. Now it's raised 51%. Just the average. What else? Average salary, almost 40%. Median salary. Compare median salary in Estonia, 800. We have 200, 1,200 something. And where the money comes from, we are all the blue one, but the money comes from our budget. No one gives additional money. 2000, 100%, 2013, 60% we seeked from our budget, 40% from government. Here we kept stability in our staff. Just got some money from government. And more or less during last 4 years, 35% of raising the budget came from government and 65% came from my budget, which also from government, but no additional money. Just reducing the staff, you can give the money and to create the motivation. Why it's important that you not change your organization without the motivation. If you are people like that, nothing happens. And you start to create your motivation from top management. First man I'm motivating is my deputy, not officer at the border. I start from deputy, heads of departments, and if I have more money, I will motivate the very low. That's clear. Because if you don't have a motivated team around you, you never achieve something. Normally what in Estonia happens, they start the motivation from up and the manager is like that. So it's again, to just name the state reform, according to my views, the state reform is a management reform and the target, like renewing, or how to say in English. You have to create a target. Well, to create the target, you have to reform the planning system. What are the targets of the states and state institutions? For example, every Director General in every country can say that the target of the tax and customs is to support the activities and developments of the companies. Everyone can say it. But I haven't seen anyone who really achieved it or run their organization like that. Me either. If I put 6 months ago, I said to my team that this will be of a new main target. And believe me, 6 months in organizations, big discussion. What we should do now? How we support? And one business representative said to me that, Marek, what you now start to do is changing the DNA of taxation. Because naturally, if you take your taxation law, your task, your previous strategies, it's not talking about the supporting. Maybe they are talking about the service, polite, front desks, blah, 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 blah. But it has been all right like that 10 years ago. But how to support? For example, if auditor goes to company, so far the target is to find something wrong, to put in more money. Instead of that, the aim of the audit should be or must be to make sure that there is no risk in the company in a sense of taxation. It's not up to bring the money. You have to reduce the risk for company, not for country, for company. You have to think when you go, you have to, from where you start. And believe me, most headache now in my audit department because they don't find the activities, how to fill it. Because the tasks coming from law is different. Put the fines, put the audit, no, okay, enforcement. It's technology is there, but believe me, in Estonian case, just I don't know. What's interesting? If I'm talking about that, very often I'm reflecting other director generals and managers listening with Marek. We are doing it already for years. And I'm thinking, how you can do it? For me, it's so hard to feel it, this kind of attitude of thinking. And you're saying you are doing it already. Here's the same. All these keywords, there's nothing to do. Can't say nothing, but most of it, there is a limited connections with daily life. From public sector, e-invoices, smart solutions, user-friendly environment, data reuse, I don't know, machine to machine. Zero. These 5,000 companies, everyone puts the declarations electronically, but we haven't had automated connections because our company is thinking that it's too big investments to do it. The cheaper is to year by year use the bookkeepers filling the information somewhere in an e-taxation, open data, whatever. So if I'm saying we are rewriting it, we are taking all these functionalities on board. E-invoices and nothing, no links with innovation. Has been for years already, but public service doesn't use it. It doesn't go because nobody. But I will show how we will do it. We would like to say that Estonia is the first country getting rid of tax declaration at all. Why we need tax declaration anymore? A couple of weeks ago, I started this discussion and one famous lawyer says that I don't know, he doesn't know anyone. Kuidas on mõistuse juures inimest, no? Reasonable person who likes to fill the tax declaration and pays the taxes. So the idea sounds great. How we can get rid of tax declarations at all. And now we are working together with 2 banks. And how we do it is easy. Me and you having a company, we want to pay the taxes, but we don't want to fill the tax declaration. So the solution might be, or can be, or technology is nothing, but solution must be that just we are making a bank transactions, paying the salary. I'm letting me, as an entrepreneur, the bank send information about these concrete transactions to tax and customs. We are calculating taxes, sending e-invoice back to your bank, and that's it. No, you should do nothing. And it's easy. So, more or less 95,000 companies in Estonia, which is a small and medium companies. Let's say that we don't need your bookkeeping. Instead of that, we are helping you and serve you to make your tax calculation if you trust and share the information. That's it. No declaration. It's not obligatory. It's a voluntary. Nowadays also. So if I can present my tax declaration on paper. Nobody does it because it's not reasonable to do it. It's costly. So all these new services has to be very easy, and there needs time to get used to build the trust, to set up this tax morale. Audit in the brackets of small business. Let's say that we don't control you. It's up to you how you behave. Because if you want to control, it costs more when we bring the money in a state. Let's create the environment of information or reflect the information. You know how much you have paid. You have your average indicators in a region, in a business, in a sector. You can make a smarter decision online. You have your risk. We have a prediction system or something like that. Please be careful. You have you can compare yourself with partners. And believe to collect this 10% of taxes we can do through the VAT approach much more effective. When saying out, one day we might come and control you. Sharing economy, it's gone. Nobody stops it. And I was in Parliament today, 2 hours discussing about that. And next week I will be in Washington meeting an Uber strategy manager, David Bluff. And look what Uber has done. They have one app over the world. You can live in Estonia or, I don't know, Germany, States. One app, the same one, as a driver or as a client. I have a dream. Why every country collecting their taxes in an own way. Let's Estonia doing together with Uber, but Estonia will collect all the taxes of other countries. So you are laughing, but it's reasonable to do it. Doesn't matter where you drive. But if you drive through the Uber guarantees this information flow to Estonian Tax and Customs. We are presenting all the reflection of the information to your tax declaration, and you can pay your taxes. Technology is piece of cake, again. But I'm just offering him and trying to see how he reacts of that, because it's a smart way to do it, and it sounds very reasonable. Of course, I know if I take Germany, no way, we collect our taxes ourselves. We cannot trust you. But I like to think like that. To test the reaction, your laugh is great because you have used the Uber. I'm a Uber client. Excellent service. Somebody says it's a typical service for Estonians because you don't have to talk to anybody. You just order your taxi. You know who is coming with what car. You're sitting in a taxi. No, it's not taxi. You're sitting in a car. Driver already know where do you want to go. You're driving. thinking your thoughts, and you leave in the car. You have an impression you are not paying at all. But after you have done 5 meters from a car, you get an email that this was your marshroute and or track and how much you pay. Excellent service. And now we are trying to make happy with traditional service taxi economy. You can't make happy in a way how we are behaving. The most biggest license is trust, not paper issued by civil service or authority. It's history. Most bigger license is trust. Yeah. And then what is the Uber using? Estonia is the first country we have a Uber drivers who pay the taxes. First country in the world. One is Heino Seljamaa, who is a famous actor. No, can't say famous. It's a hack. Everybody knows it. He told it in a public. That's why I can say, because it's a tax secret. Heino Seljamaa said he earned 13,000 euro driving the Uber last year. And we made, together with Uber service, that Heino Seljamaa made just 1 click. And Uber sent this data to his tax declarations. We presented it, and Heino did another click in our environment. It's paid. So, and he can say loudly, very proudly in a society, I'm a Uber driver, and I pay the taxes. Politicians asked how much people did like that. I said, I don't tell you, because it's not important. It's the first year we did it, and now we have to start to work with tax morale, make this service available, understandable, but people feeling as a citizens pay more taxes. Old tradition sector, the taxi sector says, we pay the taxes. I said, no. Let's make one thing clear. Both traditional and Uber, if you take generally, nobody pays the taxes. But I think this Uber start to pay first or more, because it's easier. I think it was a last one, yes. So instead of declarations, you will start to see your declarations just on your phone. Thank you. You share the information, we reflect back, and that's it. There's one mistake in that picture. Who finds it? It's a flight mode. I don't know who did like that, but somebody discovered it. It's a flight mode, how you can see that picture. So thank you.
Does someone dare to share some thoughts about it?
Change our way of thinking.
Sorry, say again?
Change our way of thinking, for example.
Change of thinking. All right, thank you. Thank you. Anyone else?
For example,
There's no true or wrong here. Let me stress that explicitly.
people are thinking about disruptive change, not just improvements. For example,
Right, okay.
cultural way of doing things differently.
Okay, maybe one more, yeah?
And also for the sake of achieving some societal goals, not just for business purposes, for example.
Okay. Well, those are better answers than I came up with initially, because we got an EU grant for doing research to social innovation, and I was thinking, what the heck is social innovation, actually?
That is saying a lot of things about content.
Well, let's leave that out of... Oh, this is being taped. Oh, shit. But after, let's say, 3.5 years of research, I did come up with an answer what social innovation is and what social innovation might stimulate. So that's what I want to discuss today. When you Google it, yeah, well, I think I erased the slide, but whatever. When you Google it, then you see these 3 images. Or you see a lot of images, but among others, these 3 images. And what you see here is a group of people What you see here is another group of people apparently having very bright ideas. And here you see a word for it, saying words like social, people, world, companies, society, blah, 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 and so on and so on. So why did I put up these pictures? Well, apparently, social innovation is about people. Well, that might be some sort of an open door, but the thing is that when you look to the academic literature to social innovation, then it's not so much about finding the right solution or the cheapest solution or the best effective solution to a certain problem. It's about getting the solution which has the mostly social has been broadly shared by as many people as stakeholders as possible. So it's about getting a solution legitimized rather than finding a best solution. And that could be that innovative processes, social innovative processes, are actually might result in something, well, the man has already left, but in something that we are already doing for some years. But now we have an innovative, socially innovative process behind it which supports it. So that's the answer I would give after 3.5 years doing of research to social innovation about what is social innovation. But then the question, of course, becomes, why should we pay attention to social innovation? And here you see again 3 images. Let me start with this one. As you all know, Europe and the entire Western world has gone through an economic crisis the last couple of years, which makes public services, the affordability of public services, very difficult, and ask new questions about what public services actually might cost. And to illustrate that furthermore, let me show this picture. Here you see an aging woman. Our societies, our Western societies, are aging, which in the first place is a good thing, of course. But in light, of course, with an economic crisis, who is gonna pay for the health care of our parents, of ourselves when we are older? And the thing is, and that's the social innovative part about it, this brings along a numerous very difficult question, because this brings along questions like, what is actually the cost of a human life, of an older human life? And with these kind of problems, there are no easy answers. There are no apps or technical solutions which give you an answer to that. Then it's about finding social support for political decisions. And then the third picture. Well, here you see a very young football supporter of a famous Dutch club called Feyenoord. And as you see, he is learning in a very early age to express his voice. And we are living in a democracy where people are being encouraged to find their voice and use that voice and express that voice within the public domain. So then the social innovative question becomes, how do you give rise to all those voices? And also, in particular with these kind of voices, do we also need some kind of scrutiny procedure, or maybe even some canalizing dynamics? So this is a little bit why it is important to us to even study social innovation. And so we did. LIPSE stands for Learning from Innovation in Public Sector Environments. And we conducted the research with 12 different universities from the entire European Union. And the beauty of doing, next to all kinds of challenges which I won't go into detail about, the beauty of it is that you can see parts of social innovations from different sides, from the north, from the east to the west and the south of the European Union. So all the research we have conducted within the scope of this project was international comparative. So, we started up with cutting up LIPSA, or cutting up social innovation, into several sub-parts. We call them work packages. And each work package was focused on a specific aspect of social innovation. For instance, we compared major cities in Europe, named Barcelona, Rotterdam, also Copenhagen, and we were wondering whether public officials rather go to citizens or civil society actors, or to professional organizations, or maybe to other municipalities if they encounter some sort of a problem. And that's what we call innovative capacity. Where lies the innovative capacity of such a city? And it turns out that as a reflex, hierarchy is still very important. So if a public official encounters a problem, then it seems to be going to a higher placed official. The next work package was about citizen initiatives. What kind of citizen initiatives are being conducted within the entire European Union, and what can we learn from them with regards to how they actually contribute to the common good? This was a very complicated work package, but it is about whether, for instance, competitions, open applications for municipal funds contribute to innovative capacity of citizens or not. Every scholar, probably everyone who's working with innovation, will agree on that it's kind of a risky business. And within the context of public sectors, we ask ourselves, how do governments deal with that? Do they encounter risks? Do they experience them as risks? And do they have a strategy in order to cope with those risks? And the fifth one, this might be the most interesting one for you. That's actually the question whether ICT-driven innovation can also be examined or considered as social innovations. Because ICT-driven innovation, to us initially, we thought that's mainly about finding that best solution, that smart solution, and not so much about whether that solution has enough social support. What did we find? And I'm just going to cherry pick here. Well, I already said something about the social networks. I said that hierarchy is very important, that public officials tend to go to higher placed public officials if they encounter a problem. But if they want to find an innovative solution, that's how they label it, then they rather go to civil society actors. Then they rather go to companies. Because the general idea is that governments are not very innovative. Okay. This one, here you see someone who is being excluded. And that is actually one of the results of the co-creation work package. Nowadays, the efforts of citizens as being the new tool of governments for public services is a very popular thought. However, our research shows that that has an exclusive mechanism, because most citizen initiatives tend to be initiated by people for people who are much alike like them. So in general, the higher educated, the well-prosperous citizens for other high educated and prosperous citizens. So that leaves a very big group within society untouched. And within the context of public sector innovation, that might be very well a problem, because governments, of course, have a responsibility to all citizens and not just the ones who are taking citizen initiatives. This one, I'm a social entrepreneur. We were wondering what is the biggest driver for social innovation? What is the key thing, what you need if you want to have a broadly shared solution for a problem. And everyone is pointing at the social entrepreneur. There has to be an individual, and it can be an organization, it could be a person, could be several individuals, but there has to be someone who is pushing the buttons, who is pushing the limits. And they also, most of the people mentioned that as a social entrepreneur, you need to have a lot of stamina because public sector organizations are very slow. Last one, and it was predominantly came that across in the ICT work package. We were asking the question, why do municipalities actually adopt an ICT-driven solution? For instance, teleworking, allowing public officials, colleagues to work at home instead of going to the office, a very kind of a simple thing. What makes municipalities decide on to allow that or not? And it turns out to be that it's peer pressure. And I think Mr. Helm already mentioned that. It is about whether your neighbor municipality is doing that as well. If they don't, then you don't need to do it either. And to us that was kind of surprising. So in general, I think that the main contribution of LIPSE, of what LIPSE is actually showing us, is that these are all parts of the same medallion to some extent. Like I said, social networks are important for innovative capacity, but there's a danger for exclusive mechanisms here. Social entrepreneurs, the roles of individuals are very important, but on the other hand, collective issues like peer pressure are also important. So all sides of the same medallion. So if we want to shrink it down to only one variable, we say it's about willingness. The willingness of, on the one hand, citizens, society, we just labeled them as citizen participation, but the willingness of people to do something for the common good, to do something for their society. And on the other hand, obviously the willingness of government to collaborate with citizens. Well, if you simplify the world in a 4x4 matrix, then you see this. There's a scenario where there's high willingness on both sides and low willingness on both sides and something in between. And let me illustrate the two most extreme forms of these scenarios, because we were already able to see in the LIPSE project some examples of that. And the first one took place right here in Estonia. It's an initiative called Marjakula. Say again?
Marigila.
Okay, whatever. A very nice initiative. Is someone who is familiar with this initiative except for Piret? Yeah? Okay, well, maybe I hope I'm not going to step on some toes here, but in general what the idea was that it began as some sort of a protest of parents who had children with disabilities. And they objected the fact that disabled children were dragged out to institutionalized care, and they argued that that might not be in the best interest of their child. Instead of that, they initiated this initiative in order to provide childcare services in more residential care. That could be either at home or in, let's say, a substitute home. And the thing is that the involved public officials agreed on this. They thought it was a very good idea to do that. So we see willingness of citizens on the one hand, and we see also willingness of the government on the other hand. But there's a kind of an issue, a question mark that also needs to be raised. Because what I already said, social innovation, it's more about finding social support rather than finding the best solutions. And involved medical professionals, healthcare professionals, they argued that, yeah, this might be a very nice initiative, a very good initiative from a moral perspective, but whether healthcare for children with disability has been increased, that is questionable. So to us, this is a very good example of a succeed social innovation, where there is willingness on both sides, but whether it's the best solution, that's still a question. The other side of the spectrum is the wastelands, and this is a picture of a playground, and it's actually an educative playground in Slovakia. And it was part of the project called Prehistory. The idea was that citizens wanted to have a playground for their children. A nicer playground than just a park which only has some grass. They want to have some toys in there and something more tailor-made to their children. And again, the government decided to agree on that. And they said there are two conditions. First, you, citizens, have to maintain it once it has been established. And two, it has to have an educative element. So here you see an old-fashioned well. So those were the two conditions, and everyone agreed on that. So initially it started as a very innovative solution. But after a while, the children who initially went there, they grew up. They didn't want to go to the playground anymore. And the parents who were responsible of maintaining the playground thought, well, my children are not going to the playground anymore. Why should I keep maintaining it? And the government, on the other hand, thought, well, citizens are not going to maintain it. We're not going to maintain it either. Because that was not the agreement, right? So ultimately, this beautiful playground here became some sort of a wasteland where nobody really cared about. So what initially, what the lesson here is that what initially was raised as a very promising, innovative solution is some sort of a snapshot. And if there are no dynamics taking care of the sustainability of the solution, then it might not survive. So, what does this have to do with smart cities? And I'm absolutely no expert on smart cities. I only think that there's some questions and potentials to be raised when it comes to the connection between smart cities and social innovations. Let me start with the potential. I think that using big data, using all kinds of fancy and smart tools is a very effective way to monitor what citizens actually want. And then I think, for instance, to viewer ratings, using algorithms to find out what preferences are. And I think that, and this is specifically important in democracies, that you can find the support, the data, to see new majorities. For instance, if you want to do a poll about a new policy, smart cities could help you to give the advice whether that's a good idea or not. And you remember that little guy with the middle finger up. If there's a way to give as many people as possible their voice, then smart city is the solution to that. But I also think that there are a lot of potential threats about this, and I think this should be kept into consideration. When you talk about monitoring, then there's always the ethical dilemma behind it. To what extent are you, as a government, allowed to take data, to analyze the history of citizens on the web? Are you, for instance, familiar with the app called Happen? Who is? No? Okay, Tinder maybe? Tinder, all right. What happened is Tinder in a next step, which shows people who might be of interest to you, but is related to a geographical location. So if I start the Happen app now, then it shows a number of women, in my case, who have been in a close range of, let's say, 500 meters. And to me, that's a little scary. I don't want some app to follow me wherever I go, and even make my sexual preference in this case, actually. So I think that's an ethical dilemma. I also said that social innovation has an exclusive element in it. I also said that smart cities might help you to find new majorities. So how does that relate to each other? I think by definition, those are opposing elements. So how can smart governments or smart cities actually prevent exclusion of new majorities? This one, again, the guy with the middle finger on. If everyone is talking, is there also still someone who is listening? And who is that? And does smart cities allow us to listen or only to talk? Right now, the most applications I heard in that regard are about talking, not so much about listening. And in the end, I think there's a danger of a simplistic focus. Innovation is the biggest buzzword there ever was. You can be against innovation. Innovation is good, it is new, it is better. So innovation can become a goal in itself. Could also be the case with smart government, smart cities. You want to be the smartest city, that's nice to put on your record, right? But what does that smart city actually do for common goods? These are just a number of issues, questions I want to raise in connection to social innovation and smart cities. Thank you all for your attention.